back, ladies and gentlemen, for our afternoon session. Later this afternoon, around about 2:15, 2:30, I'll be handing over the podium to our colleagues at the Global Wind Energy Council, and we will turn at that stage to look at the new markets for offshore wind, those emerging economies, Vietnam, Indonesia, Colombia, Brazil, many of whom were over the river this morning pledging their commitment to end coal. But before we get there, I thought that we would spend some time exploring one facet of the number of different reforms to energy markets globally that we were talking about this morning. And that's the continued evolution of the corporate power purchase market. And I'm delighted that we're joined by both Mike Hayes, Global Lead at KPMG for Renewables and Decarbonisation, and his colleague Wafa Jaffrey, who's their Global PPA Leader. And I'm going to hand it over straight to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam. Hope the mic is on. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. This session is going to focus on the corporate PPA market, but there's probably very little that Wafa and I could tell this audience about PPAs from a developer and an investor perspective. Instead, in this session, we're going to focus on the corporate customer. Wafa will introduce herself in a second, but we both do a lot of work with corporates and have been doing so for many years, even though we've very much grown up on the development and generation side of the business. But what we wanted to get across the audience this afternoon was the perspectives of corporates, how they think about corporate PPA opportunities, what they are looking for in those corporate PPA opportunities. And also we're going to expand the discussion into the relevance of corporate PPAs for the offshore wind sector. And then throughout this session, I want to bring a net zero overlay to the whole thing, because my overall proposition is net zero, and the pace at which net zero is happening at a corporate level is probably one of the best things ever for this industry. And the message I keep giving to developers: get ready for more and more corporate PPAs. So before we get into the detailed discussion, I'm going to let my good colleague and friend Wafa Jaffrey introduce herself.
Thanks, Mike. I hope the mic is working.
Yep,
great. So thank you for that, and thank you everyone for being here, Adam and Mainstream for having us here today. I'm Wafa Jaffrey, and I lead KPMG's global corporate PPA practice, which is to say that I help corporates decarbonize their energy consumption by procuring renewable electricity. We heard a lot about a just transition this morning from Nicola, from Mary, and this is us doing our part in helping corporates deliver on that just transition. Looking forward to a fascinating discussion, Mike.
Great. So we're going to come back to just transition and really some of the really exciting things that are happening that are forcing corporates to really think ever more seriously about corporate PPAs. But before we get into all that, Wafa, could you tell the audience exactly what you do when a corporate, as we've seen many times, they pick up the phone to you and say, we want to implement a renewable procurement strategy throughout the globe in all of our operating plants. Maybe just walk through exactly the approach we take with those corporates, the type of work we do, before we get into some of the technical aspects.
Sure. There are three key aspects of what we do, three key phases. The first is around the strategy. The second is the actual execution of the transaction. We very much approach corporate PPAs as a transaction whereby we help our clients select the developer that is going to deliver renewable energy contract and signing of that corporate PPA. And then afterwards, the third phase is around monitoring. So in the strategy phase, it's really about bringing the various business units across the globe together to sign up to that renewable energy strategy, to come up with that strategy, to help explain what the implications of that are going to be on the business. We then go into the second phase, which is finding that developer that's going to meet the corporate's objectives. This is where our pedigree of being in renewable transactions comes in quite handy, because we have all of those relationships already. And then the third phase is to ensure that the monitoring and the delivery of renewable electricity is being delivered as the corporate would have wanted.
One of the things that Wafa and I have discovered is a vast difference between where corporates are in understanding corporate PPAs. So we both worked on a very major transaction with one of the oil majors, Chevron. It's in the public domain a couple of years ago. And for such a big player in the energy industry, we had to start at the very beginning in educating them in terms of how the renewable energy worked, why it was different to the oil and gas sector, and how corporate PPAs, on-site, off-site, virtual worked. So fascinating journey. We come across other clients in all sectors and even in financial services who are very, very clued in on corporate PPAs, and some of them will try to do it themselves. And then, between that, we are working with automotive companies, pharmaceutical companies. I mean, this is spreading across every single industry. I will say to this audience as well, I'm now seeing not just renewable developers coming to the market with solutions. Increasingly, we're seeing certain types of real estate technology companies who do that part of the sort of building infrastructure and technology around infrastructure are starting to position themselves in this market as well. So there is new competition coming into it. So, Wafa, coming back to the sort of the interactions we have with corporates globally, one of the key pieces of work we do at the very beginning is establishing the criteria. What is it that the corporate is looking for when it starts thinking about a global renewable energy procurement process?
Yeah, I mean, there are three key things that keep coming up over and over again. The first one is around financial impact. So it looks at things like the cost of procuring renewable electricity. Is it going to be more than what they're currently paying? The second is around volatility, and then the third is around accounting. The second key thing that they want to look at, I mean, this is all from a very much a decarbonization lens. So they want to make sure that the transfer of REC is possible. The third key aspect is deliverability. They are making a public commitment and making sure that it's deliverable, and the fact that they're able to achieve on their commitment is absolutely critical.
Before I get into sort of what I would call some of the practical road bumps that we hit in practice, Wafa, it might be worth touching on the REC market, which you just mentioned. One of the things that we've experienced is that this idea of just buying RECs as a solution has very much fallen out of fashion, and now the trend is additionality. There has to be a real project behind it.
I think, Mike, I would add that RECs is also a little bit of an issue in a lot of the markets. Like, for example, in Mexico, there is no actual international standard whereby you can transfer RECs just as yet. So that's an issue that keeps coming up. From an additionality point of view, you're absolutely right. A lot of our clients want a new renewable asset to be put forward for their own consumption. So they want that additionality. They want the asset not to have been operating, so that they can then claim that this asset, this renewable generation asset, has been brought forward strictly for to fulfill the consumption of our clients.
And maybe just, Wafa, if we could just zero in on this deliverability aspect, because I know we've worked with some European-based global clients recently, and they were, because of their own corporate commitments around net zero and decarbonisation, they had a very strict timeline, in terms of executing the PPA, but more importantly, in terms of when it was operational. So one of the things that we think about, I think, when we're dealing with developers is, do they have projects that are at a late stage of development or are in construction? And that's increasingly becoming an issue. It used to be the case that we were able to look at projects at the very beginning of their life cycle, but I've seen a push more towards later stage projects just to get this up and running as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely right. The way they're looking at this is from a deliverability point of view is pre-FID, but post-planning. And most importantly, grid connections, because they seem to keep coming up as a major issue in the renewable industry. So post-planning, post-grid connection, but pre-FID to prove that additionality. It's a major driver for one of the transactions that I'm currently leading for Network Rail in the UK, a transport client, and for them additionality is absolutely critical, and deliverability is as well. So there is a sweet spot between planning and pre-FID.
So that was the easy part, and corporates are coming to us, and I will talk a little bit about the market later. And by the way, we'll do questions at the end, but if anybody wants to ask questions as we proceed, we'd like this to be an informal session. the reality, Wafa, is that when we start working with these global corporations, there's a number of particular issues that come up all the time. And what we find is that the people we deal with on the development side have very little visibility or even appreciation of just how big some of these issues are on the corporate side. The one I wanted to start off with is an odd one, maybe to this audience, but as you know, it's a mega issue, which is the accounting issue. So maybe you'd explain to the audience why that's such a big issue, number one, and number two, the approaches we take to help resolve the issue where we can.
So I think, Mike, I'm one of the very few people within KPMG who's not an accountant. But the accounting issue with corporates has meant that I've had to deal with it quite often. There are two key perspectives that we keep coming up with specifically from a European perspective. One is the IFRS 16, which is about judging whether or not an asset or a contract is going to be an operating lease. The second is IFRS 9, which is around derivative accounting, which is applicable to virtual PPAs, something we are seeing increase quite a bit even on this side of the pond. It was very prevalent in the US, and that's where the corporate PPA market really started. But more and more we're seeing that in Europe as well. And IFRS accounting and what the derivative actually looks like is having an impact on corporates' decisions. From a C-suite level point of view, when we're doing our stakeholder engagement in our strategy phase of the work, all that the FDs and the CFOs want to understand is what this means for them from a balance sheet perspective, from an accounting perspective, and how or if at all it can tie their hands in their normal course of business.
Yeah, for example, we're working on a 3 gigawatt project in the Middle East, and the number one issue on the corporate side is what it does to their balance sheet. And my perspective for what it's worth is developers don't understand quite why they don't understand why we come to them saying we need you to structure the PPA in these ways in order to get it off balance sheet. And it's a surprising issue, and for those of you who practice in the energy efficiency issue, which is much smaller scale, it's exactly the same issue. It's accounting law gone crazy, but it's actually in reality acting as a barrier to we could do a lot more transactions if it wasn't the case. So that's the first practical issue we encounter in practice, Wafa. We didn't get to what I call the 24/7 issue. I want renewable power every hour of the day, 7 days a week. And there's different models in the market. So maybe take us through where we've got to in that particular conundrum.
Sure. From a 24/7 perspective, a solar market has been quite big in the corporate PPA world. So solar assets, solar generation. The other one is wind, and what corporates are really looking for now are 24/7. Now, from a market perspective, you've had shaping products come in from traders. You've had new products come in from utilities to be able to provide electricity that is matched to the demand. However, there is no guarantee that that electricity is renewable electricity. It's importing from the grid, especially if you're looking at virtual PPAs or if you're looking at off-site PPAs. So one of the things that seems to keep coming up over and over again, and again, Mike, we've talked quite a bit about it, is the use of storage and energy storage in order to deliver that renewable electricity on a 24/7 basis.
Yeah, so I mean, it's increasing, becoming an issue because the idea that you're just trading power, which may or may not be green, is again something that the world has moved on a little bit from. When we do these type of transactions with corporates, Wafa, we tend to deal first of all with the procurement team or the sustainability team, and they get it, they understand what we're doing, we engage with developers, but actually our experience is that that's not enough. We need to bring the whole corporation with us on some of these, and it's one of the reasons why these transactions take a long time to implement and are slower than they should otherwise be.
No, absolutely. I mean, stakeholder management and taking all of the individual business units through what it is that we are trying to do, what the corporate is trying to achieve, what the group level is trying to achieve, is absolutely critical, because at the end of the day, it is going to be the individual business units who are going to have to live with the contracts. Another large part of this, which keeps coming up more and more, especially because it's such a major C-suite discussion now, is around organizational capability. How is it that the organization that is going to sign up to 10 or 15-year agreements, whether that's is considered a derivative, whether that is considered a physical purchase of power or hedging, is actually going to deal with monitoring that PPA and delivering on its renewable objectives. So organizational capability is another major aspect that we are helping corporates work towards.
And especially for some of the corporates we're dealing with, they have operations in 40, 50 countries with multiple sites. And we probably don't have time to get into it, but in some situations, multiple very small sites. And a challenge for us is to get developers who are prepared to take on that scale where it's potentially hundreds of different physical locations.
The other aspect of it, Mike, is around regulation, right? Because there are so many countries, each with their own individual regulations, all of that has a completely different impact.
And I'm going to come back to some of the regulatory challenges a little bit later, Wafa. But before I do that, I want to turn really just to talk about the corporate market. So I think at the very start, you mentioned we saw the PPA thing start off in the US and it's grown exponentially. And I think we have a message to this audience. You have seen nothing yet in terms of corporate demand. Right through this first couple of days of COP26, you've heard a lot about sort of the finance agenda, but there was some really important announcements yesterday around reporting standards. The bottom line is very, very simple. Corporates, both public companies, and it's not just my perspective, people like Mark Carney has said this as well yesterday. Private companies are going to be brought into the realm. In the UK, the Chancellor announced a week ago that UK listed companies, but with huge pressure for private companies, will have to disclose their climate transition plans. The GFAN's 130 trillion announcement made yesterday, within the detail of that, all those banks who are going to be dispersing that 130 trillion will be looking at the climate transition plans of the people they're lending to. So the pressure that's starting to arrive in the corporate world to decarbonize, whether it's from your investors, governments, employees, your peers, supply chain, it doesn't matter. What's actually happening is all these forces are coming together. And WAFA, which is an incredible thing, but the sheer scale of transformation at a corporate level is going to be phenomenal. But to the renewable world, which you and I have grown up with, this is actually a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And I think the message we have is prepare yourself and get ready because the corporate demand is going to be exponential.
No, absolutely. I mean, Amazon is the largest procurer of electricity, of renewable electricity across the globe now, right? So absolutely. Where we're moving from is, Scope 2 emissions reduction is only half of the equation. We need to get further and further ahead. In most of my conversations now, it's not just about, right, so we need to decarbonize, we need green power, please help us get green power. It's moved on to, we have a supply chain, we need to get our supply chain decarbonized, we need to reduce our Scope 3 emissions. How do we take the solution that we are implementing to them?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to dwell a little bit on the Scope 3 challenge, and give some practical examples. Some of the major technology companies in this world who have been, they've made either net zero, some of them have made net negative, you name it, they've made the commitments. They will tell you they have one major problem, and that major problem is Scope 3. They can do incredible things to reduce their own Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, but really, getting the data from their suppliers is a huge challenge. But even if they can manage that bit of it, they need to get their suppliers to decarbonize, and that is a really significant challenge because at least the corporate tends to be a very large-scale corporate. Their supply chain is made up of a mixture of smaller and larger companies, and that's something that needs to be cracked. But again, there's no escaping from this. The pressures are there on these companies. I mentioned a couple of minutes ago climate transition plans. The ability of these corporates to access finance in the future is going to be dependent on where they are in climate transition. It is that simple. And when we talk to clients, as I do all the time, on their net zero strategy, and there's a whole bunch of solutions, the number one solution we mention every single time is renewable energy. Because the market is there. You mentioned cost earlier on, Wafa. It doesn't necessarily involve additional cost. Importantly, it involves certainty, which is one of the big advantages. So all of the other things we look at on a decarbonization journey, we look at things like circular economy, we look at carbon offsets, we look at new technology solutions. We look at energy efficiency. The low-hanging fruit is renewable procurement. I'm not saying it can be done in every single instance. It cannot, because there's always, we've spoke about some of the problems, and particularly when you've got lots of smaller operations where we are finding that to be difficult in practice. But, the message I think I have is watch what's going on across the wider corporate agenda around decarbonisation, because this industry, which we're all part of it, and we love what this industry has done, this industry actually needs to step up further to take advantage of this opportunity. So, Wafa, we've covered some of the practical issues and some of the detail around corporate PPAs, but if I look behind me here, the theme of the day is offshore wind.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe, and when we talk about PPAs, I naturally think about onshore solar and wind. We have seen some significant offshore transactions, but only a handful. Ørsted with TCMS in Taiwan, to name one, which is 820 megawatts. But maybe you might guide us through where you think the offshore wind industry has a role to play in all of this.
Sure, I think there are three key things that I would mention there. The first one being, so far, offshore wind assets and generation stations have been far too large for a corporate to actually procure renewable electricity from, right? The biggest client I have is Network Rail, 4.1 terawatt hours right now and rising up to 4.5. And what they really want to do is do that in chunks or in tranches so that they're actually getting the benefit of technology advancements. So because of that, there hasn't really been a lot of corporate PPA transaction for offshore wind. But having smaller tranches of megawatts, bringing those to market to be able to procure would be great, just like the way Amazon has done with a Scottish wind farm, for that matter. The second I would say is, as we talked about earlier, it's not just going to be about renewable procurement. Going forward, what RE100 is going to then set up is Hydrogen 100. So the combination solution of offshore wind and hydrogen is going to be critical for a lot of our clients and the corporates. And the third one, which is the messiest, but I would say which has the far the best potential for offshore wind, is focusing on scope 3. I'm having a conversation, and I'm going to embark on this very stressful journey fairly soon, is helping a pharmaceutical company bring all of its supply chain together in Europe, along with its own consumption, to then have a mega demand to decarbonize. But the only way we can do that is by pulling it together with all of the challenges that it's going to have in terms of all the different boards of companies who are going to have different requirements, making sure the procurement is run in a way that all of the various companies and boards are comfortable with, and then the proof will be in the final numbers as well. But that in itself is given the amount of electricity we'll be able to pool together for a single transaction, would be able to provide that opportunity for offshore wind.
But I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist. Like we grew up on doing sort of a transaction with a single corporate. What you're talking about is trying to do a transaction for hundreds of corporates
together.
And sometimes even more than that. I mean, that sounds impossible. I want to just dwell.
It's a challenge, Mike. It's going to be a fun challenge.
Well, you solve it, Wafa, because how credible do you think this idea of syndicating or clubbing a whole bunch of corporates together is with a single developer? And I say this particularly in the context of offshore wind, because offshore wind transactions by their nature tend to be much larger, but the only way it's really going to work to actually match that with corporate demand is grouping corporates together, whether it's scope 3, or I'm going to give another example in a second.
Look, even within a corporate, it is quite difficult to bring different people together, align on the same parameters for a corporate PPA, have a single procurement, what happens in joint and several liabilities. I mean, the contract negotiation itself can be a little bit challenging, but if we are to achieve what we have set ourselves the target to this week and what we're going to set ourselves the targets to hopefully next week, it is absolutely imperative that we do that.
So the example you've given here is around scope 3 and suppliers. I want to talk about another opportunity, which I don't think the market has really thought about yet, which is the private equity world. So if you look at the big private equity players, you know, the Apollos, the KKRs, the TPGs, they are probably, it's not a criticism because there's a net zero and private equity don't actually go that well together given the short-termist nature of private equity. But all of these private equity players are coming under incredible pressure themselves, you know, and some of them are joining the various GFANs and asset owners alliances and various other things. But for them, they don't think about it as a scope 3 issue. They think about renewable procurement as an issue for the multitude of portfolio companies that they have in their different funds. And they split that group into two. They split it into controlled and non-controlled portfolio companies. Because how do you actually, where you have a minority interest in these portfolio companies, how do you exercise your control in such a way that you can force these companies to start engaging in a renewable procurement strategy? I can tell you this is one of the hot topics that I'm involved in, and I work with most of those names that I mentioned. And we are actually trying to put our minds together about how we can come with a single structured solution that you can walk up to a Blackstone or an Apollo or wherever else and say, this is the group solution, you know, this is how it's going to work to bring your controlled and your non-controlled portfolio companies together. We haven't cracked it yet, but the message I think I want to leave is that, you know, this is very serious. There's a real motivation to make it work, and we are going to find some way to do it because there is no hiding place for these corporates anymore. So we've covered lots of diverse topics, but I want to come to sort of the last one, Wafa, which is, you know, let's not forget one really important point. You cannot do corporate PPAs in every part of the world. You know, in reality, you know, you touched on regulation as being one of the big things that we think about. But in reality, and particularly as I look across the developing world, and again, to link it back to your comments on Scope 3, from many of the larger companies in the world, their Scope 3 suppliers are in the very regions where corporate PPAs just don't work. So maybe you might just elaborate a little bit on some of the actual regulatory barriers that are in place that are stopping corporate PPAs in a multitude of countries.
Sure. I mean, we've done a paper with the World Economic Forum on the key barriers earlier in the year. I mean, it's, you know, you talked about what the financial institutions are doing. The work that we're doing with an insurer right now actually touches on this problem. Because each and every country, especially a lot of the countries in Southeast Asia where a lot of the supply chain is, faces those barriers, they are not able to implement corporate PPAs. The single biggest challenge, I would say, is the lack of a liberalized market whereby you can't actually procure that green energy from the generator. Right, we've seen that in South Korea. I mean,
you have to go through a utility.
Yeah, you have to go through a utility. You can't contract directly. That seems to be a major issue. The second one, I would say, is around RECs and having an IREC platform that can actually help you transfer the renewable electricity and show the credit of the renewable electricity that you're procuring. And in some regions, it's also the lack of developer appetite to contract with a corporate because they consider subsidies to be much more lucrative. So I would say it's a combination of those three.
And in this paper, and it's up on the various websites, and happy to send it to anybody, one of the arguments we've made, and I actually have two meetings coming up, one with Thailand and another one with Turkey. We've made this argument, and we've developed it out quite a bit in this position paper, that these countries are actually, you know, hurting themselves economically, because, you know, every country in the world, to some extent, will have to have a net zero ambition, and if you cannot facilitate this type of additionality around renewable energy, you're hurting yourself. But it's much deeper than that. We're all aware, and we've heard some speakers from the first session this morning about the supply chain benefits of renewables, which has been cut off. But lastly, it's the fact that in today's world, suppliers who do not partake in this revolution, probably the best word to use, they are going to find themselves squeezed out of the market. I've already had this discussion with the big technology companies. They are starting to turn the sort of the handle a little bit and saying, transform, solve this problem, or we are going to go somewhere else. And the problem is that if the regulatory regime in these countries do not facilitate or permit corporate PPAs, those suppliers are in a no-win position. They're under extraordinary pressure from their customers, but equally the regulatory regime isn't there. So while this paper started off talking about the barriers, the real argument we're making is that it's going to hurt direct investment and it's going to hurt suppliers in these countries. And already, we issued it about 2 months ago, already we're getting a bit of interest from some of these countries who are saying this is a real issue. So I've no idea where we are on time, but 5 minutes, so we'll leave it open if there's any questions, if anybody wants to ask. So, all right.
You made a passing reference to green hydrogen PPAs. Is that a here and now thing, or is it coming very soon? How close do you see the demand for that?
My personal view would be it's about 5 to 10 years away. But that said, a lot of the developer community is already starting to think about that, right? And try and come up with solutions. Whether it's a virtual hydrogen, I mean, if you can't really call it a PPA, so a hydrogen agreement, so maybe an HA, a green HA, potentially, let's name it here. But a lot of the developers are already starting to think about that, because it's not just the scope 2 emissions from electricity, it's also those from the consumption of gas. So whether that's through biogas, whether that is through production of hydrogen, something or the other, they're already thinking about offering those solutions to their corporate clients.
And I'll come to you in a second, Elizabeth, but just I want to add something else, because you've touched on a different development at COP26, which is something that John Kerry is announcing this week. I'm actually not sure whether he's announced it yet, but I have forewarning. So he's going to be announcing something called the First Movers Coalition. And this is really John Kerry saying to the world's largest corporations, we want you to start investing using all of the emerging technologies. He specifically called out direct air capture. I'm pretty certain green hydrogen is in there as well. And what he's saying to these large corporations, we know these new technologies are expensive, but we need you to take the lead on this. And I'm not quite sure, and I'll let him divulge how he's going to exert the pressure. But it goes back to what I've said right throughout this short session. This is not a static issue. Just because we're all here in COP and you've heard loads of announcements, I always tell people, look at what's really happening. Look how quickly this is accelerating. This is John Kerry saying to these companies, you know, and we might think we live in a free market. He is saying, no, I want you to exercise your muscle and your combined purchasing power to enable these technologies. That's why, I mean, I agree with Wafa. I'm probably closer to the 5 years, even though the common wisdom is the 10 years. There is some incredible pressure points happening to actually help drive this agenda. So, Elizabeth.
Hi, Elizabeth Halliday. I was just wondering, if you could please go over again the time frame for people to disclose their climate action plan, and the carbon tax and carbon border adjustment is a big topic around here. Just wondered how you thought about that and how that might impact some of these corporates and PPAs.
Yeah, so bear in mind that so there was a big announcement yesterday, Elizabeth, about launching this thing called the Sustainability Standards Board, which is a fantastic initiative. It's really going to codify and standardize things. I think we have 3 years before that's going to take effect. Okay, but the UK government separately, over a week ago, announced a whole series of measures about a green finance roadmap, and they've even introduced this concept of a UK taxonomy. But within that, they spoke about UK-listed companies having to file climate transition plans. I heard Rini Shunak talk about it yesterday. I heard Mark Carney at an interview he did last night that I attended. He spoke about it. There's two things. Those climate transition plans, I believe, are due to come into effect in 2023. But this is a really important point. Don't just think about the regulatory position. Already, the financial community who've joined up to GFANS have said, if we're going to lend and transact, we want to see those climate transition plans. So the market is actually going to move quicker than the regulators. So climate transition plans are going to become very real very quickly.
Hi, Bernard Casey, Mainstream. Thanks very much, Mike and Zafa, for a very good presentation. I'm based out in Vietnam, where we're hoping to build an offshore wind farm, and currently in Vietnam, like I guess in many countries, there's an incumbent, so you can only sell your electricity to EVN. But in Vietnam, through Eurocham, and many corporates have come together and are lobbying the government to bring in DPPA regulations. So could you say a few words around, the journey that other countries have taken, from a single incumbent to DPPA? Are we looking at many years? Are we which countries have done it quickly?
So Bernard, it won't surprise you at all that Vietnam was one of the countries we focused on. And I do a lot of work with Mainstream, or have done in the past. That certainly influenced my judgment. But also, Vietnam is one of those key countries where those big technology companies have loads of suppliers. They're targeting Vietnam, Indonesia, South Korea, even though things have moved on a bit in South Korea, parts of some of the structures in China. The reality is that there is a whole host of countries which have not moved. So the whole purpose of the work we did with the World Economic Forum, and I might actually share the paper with Niamh, and we might just get it circulated to everybody, because we think it is an important piece of work. Bernard, the bottom line is it's going to take time. But I think it's very interesting what you say, because the corporates are saying, because they're under such pressure, they're saying we're not going to accept it. We are actually going to help force this. And if those governments have sense, like you cannot really sort of hurt your foreign direct investment by not facilitating this.
I mean, the other thing I would say is it can move very, very quickly. For example, in China, about 6 months ago, we started this project for an automotive company in China seeking on-site generation, on-site renewables. At that point in time, had no idea who you would contract with, because it's provincial. Every province has its own individual developer or government that you would want to contract with. In the past 2 weeks, every single major developer or the state-owned entities now are required to help every province and provincial government in decarbonizing and installing on-site generation. So it depends. If there is a will, it can, in a lot of these countries, it can happen almost overnight.
Okay, I'm being called to account. So with that, I think the message I want to leave the audience with are two or three messages. The whole sort of rise of net zero and the various variations of that is creating an unbelievable opportunity for this community, and I really would encourage people to think deeply about it, and bear in mind, don't wait until those corporates ask. You should be going to those corporates, because they are starting to realize they need to solve this. What we've also tried to highlight today is to give this renewable generator audience a perspective on how corporates think about these issues. And thirdly, not every country can do it, but we're optimistic, and going back to your question, Bernard, that we will get it solved. But I think the message we want to leave is a very positive one. This is good for the renewable energy industry, but you have to figure out how to engage with these corporates and overcome some of the practical issues we've dealt with today. So thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of the day.
And WAFA for that session. Mike, you were good enough to mention John Kerry's